Well, we'll get going since we are at quarter after the hour. I want to begin by welcoming everyone. I'm Dee Fairchild Ruggles, Director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and it's just a real pleasure to have you here this evening, and also to have our guest speaker, who I will introduce in just a minute. Before proceeding, I want to do as we always do. I want to begin with the land acknowledgement, which is a reminder that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. Lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. In light of this, we must strive to become a vibrant community, inclusive of all our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. I also, before introducing tonight's speaker, would like to remind you that next week there is no MCT lecture. We're just going to skip a week. But the following week, October 15th, Professor Behrooz Ramari Tabrizi will be here in person to talk about Foucault. And as you should already know, the readings are available on the unit's box folder. And if you don't have the password, just email me or just to the unit, and we'll send you that password. Well, today I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Professor Timo Storck, who will speak to us about theories of psychoanalysis. If you have questions during this talk or at its conclusion, would you please put them in the Q&A, or I think it's in chat, that's what it's called, where Professor Storck can read them and where I will also read them aloud to the audience during the Q&A session. Our visitor, Timo Storck, studied psychology, philosophy, and theology at the University of Bremen and obtained the doctorate with a dissertation on the process of artistic creation. After the PhD, he earned his habilitation in 2016 with a thesis on case conferences in inpatient psychotherapy. After completing his degrees, he continued his clinical training and worked in private practice in Germany and Austria. Since 2015, he has also held the position of professor for clinical psychology and psychotherapy at the Psychologische Hochschule. German is not one of my languages, Timo. I'm sorry if I just massacred that. In Berlin, where his research addresses conceptual skills in psychotherapy, conceptual research and methodology, psychoanalytic theory of illness, and film psychoanalysis. He is co-editor of several journals and book series, and is the author of numerous monographs, 19 authored books or co-authored volumes, to be specific, and a great many articles on subjects ranging from Freud and psychosomatics to Game of Thrones and TV binge watching. It's quite a spectrum. With that, please, join me in welcoming, we'll do it silently, our speaker. And Timo, you have the floor.
Thanks, Didi, for the kind introduction, and thank you, everyone, for participating today. We'll have plenty of time to discuss things about my talk and about psychoanalysis in general, and about psychoanalysis in film, which we'll present as some focus of my talk today. I'll share my slides with you so I can begin and also give you an overview what it is you'll be seeing and hearing for the past 50 minutes or so. So actually, I entitled my talk, Critical Psychoanalysis, Different Stages, Same Conflicts, which references also the development of psychoanalysis as a discipline, psychoanalytic theory, but also like the stages where psychoanalysis enters the world of mental development, mental conflicts, which is not only the consulting room, but also movie theaters, the social world, and other arenas and stages where human conflicts come into play. My talk will consist of 3 parts. I'll give you a brief overview about what psychoanalysis actually is and can mean to be today. In the second part, I'll give some ideas about the methodological transfer of psychoanalysis to other fields, and then demonstrate how that transfer can look like for the field of film and movie theaters. And then we can enter discussion about these 3 parts. So it's hard to talk about what psychoanalysis is in a brief time, in a short amount of time. I'll try to do that anyway. We can start off from a general definition of psychoanalysis given by Freud, which is important as something we need to follow the idea of a possible transfer of psychoanalysis from the consulting room to other fields of research and of interesting things people do and experience. And these 3 parts have to do with psychoanalysis A being a way to treat people who suffer from mental illness. And that's the most, well, that has face value, that psychoanalysis is something people enter to be relieved of their symptoms of mental illness. But it's not just that, psychoanalysis, it is also a general theory of the mind. Unlike other psychotherapeutic disciplines, psychoanalysis presents its own developmental psychology, or psychology of what personality can be thought of. Psychoanalysis does not resort to merely academic psychology to describe human development or the structure of the human mind, but presents its own theory of these psychological subdisciplines. And the third part means that psychoanalysis is a method, a general method to investigate mental phenomena. So it's not just a treatment method, it's not just a theory, but it is a methodology that can be transferred from the consulting room to other fields. And that is what makes it, well, accessible to, or to put it differently, that's what makes other mental phenomena accessible for psychoanalysis. That is what constitutes psychoanalytic social psychology, for example. We don't so much, at least not under that term, have a cognitive behavioral social psychology. Of course, we have social psychology in terms of using the theory of learning and cognitive development, but it is not something we transfer from CBT treatment and clinical psychology to other fields. That is what is special about psychoanalysis, to present that methodology that we even can transfer from the consulting room to other stages. So if we think about what psychoanalysis is, it's not just that threefold definition, but we have conceptual or theoretical cornerstones to psychoanalysis in the around about 130 years of history of psychoanalysis. And that one of these cornerstones obviously is the unconscious. And as you probably know, the psychoanalytic unconscious is not just something that is not conscious. We have that in neuropsychology and other fields of psychology or philosophy as well, of course. But the psychoanalytic unconscious specifically has to do with the dynamics of conscious and unconscious mental phenomena. We can think of these kinds of dynamics if we think about that sometimes something that has the most emotional value for us is unconscious or is inaccessible for conscious processing, not because it's not important enough on an emotional basis, but too emotionally important. It is something we are ashamed of or feel guilty for, or something that scares us, of course. And that is part of the mental dynamics that makes something unconscious. To put it more precisely, and that's another conceptual cornerstone of psychoanalysis, it's about mental conflicts. Conflicts, roughly said, between our wishes or desires and a tendency to ward off that very wish or desire because we feel ashamed, we feel guilty or threatened by something, some of our own motives or strivings. And to deal with mental conflicts in that way means to, or relates to the possibility of something about that being mentally defended against, like in repression, which is the one mental defense mechanism that we can use to describe what's happening on the most basic level. If we feel ashamed for something we long for, repression might set in and render something about that consciously inaccessible, but still that will still have a huge impact on how we see ourselves or see the world, but from an unconscious level. So we don't consciously remember, or we aren't aware of something we wish for, but only in a displaced way psychoanalysis would hold. For example, if we have strong negative emotions towards a parent that we feel guilty for, or we don't want to feel that, then mental defense mechanisms might alter that idea and that affect, so that probably we feel angry against our boss, which is not as scary or not related to guilty feelings as much as feeling anger towards a parent might be. Of course, the most prominent conceptual cornerstone of psychoanalysis still is sexuality, but in a broader way. It's not restricted to having intercourse or to genital sexuality, but in a broader sense related to feelings of pleasure and unpleasure related to bodily interaction with others. And that's what makes Freud's idea of children's sexuality still usable, if we remind ourselves that this is not about a wish to have intercourse, but a wish to have tender bodily interaction with others. And with that come mental conflicts as well, because some instances are striving for pleasure and are striving to avoid unpleasure might come into conflict and make mental defense mechanisms necessary. There's a fourth cornerstone I listed here so far, and that is object relations, which might sound a little strange in terms of the idea of a mental object, which might sound objective or non-subjective, but with the term object relations, psychoanalysis refers, by that it refers to the mental representation of significant others. We can also have object relations to our desk or to our car, which might be of higher emotional value, but most of the time, the term object relations is used to describe the representation of other people. So psychoanalysis would hold that the building blocks of our personality and of our mental world is object relations, which means our standing in relation to significant others in one way or the other, in as the result of the interactions we've had with others. which might have been something that we learn to be trustful into others, but we might have also learned that trusting others is a risky business. But both examples show that we internalize something about the interactions we've had with others, and that, well, presents as well, the overall structure of our inner world and what we experience and expect from others. So, of course, there are other concepts, but these four can present as a starting point. As we heard, psychoanalysis is not restricted to a theory of mental illness and a treatment method for people suffering from mental illness, but also something that has to do with society, which Freud began to discuss, and other scholars after him continued that work. The most important and prominent, well-known work of Freud's is Civilization and Its Discontents, where he tries to transfer his insights about the human mind onto the field of culture and society. And one important aspect of that, and that has been criticized, of course, as a all too pessimistic view on the human individual in relation to culture and society, is that Freud argued that the whole process of thinking in humans should be understood as an inhibition of what Freud called the primary process. Primary process is a mental process that has to do with well, impulsive behavior, drive-related behavior, something where we cannot anticipate the consequences of what we do or think, but rather can only follow our drives or our needs and need fulfillment. And when Freud argues that thinking is merely an inhibition of that process, then by that he means that thinking is a way to find more elaborate ways to fulfill our wishes. In some instances, we need to, well, stop and wait for a minute and then find proper ways to follow our mental motives or fulfill our needs. For example, by collaborating with others. And that has been criticized as something that, some argument that there is no social nature of the human. It's just a detour to fulfill egoistic needs. And also other psychoanalytic authors challenged that view in terms of, well, there is a basic need for interaction with others, a basic need for bonding and entering relations. That is not just secondary, or should not be viewed as an inhibition of our egoistic needs. But that is what Freud argues in Civilization and Its Discontents. And he uses that argument of thinking as an inhibition of the primary process to argue that there's no way around tensions between the individual and society, the tension between egoistic needs and social interaction. We can come back to that later. Of course, the history of psychoanalysis showed that that's not the only way to psychoanalytically think of the relation between the individual and society. Think of Erich Fromm or Herbert Marcuse and other scholars, also in the US, that brought about different models of like the human nature in terms of cultural strivings. So in the title of my talk, I presented, well, with the subtitle, Different Stages, Same Conflicts, the idea of different stages, of course. And the first stage is the consulting room. This is actually my consulting room. This is what a real couch looks like. And we still have that today in our consulting rooms. So if we look at that first stage, we can also think about what psychoanalysis does. when entering that stage, when performing on that stage. And the most basic idea of the type of change psychoanalysis brings about in the consulting room is the Freudian idea that psychoanalytic treatment is about fostering insight into mental conflicts and unconscious meanings. That's what the psychoanalytic dialogue in a consulting room is about. And behind that is the idea that gaining insight for a patient in psychotherapy, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is a way to relieve someone from their psychopathological symptoms. Because once we enter or we find insight into conflicts, we can find different ways of coping with mental conflict and also with interpersonal conflicts, of course. Psychoanalysis has found different ways to describe that process of change, or that type of change that becomes possible during psychoanalysis. Freud described that as where it was, ego shall be, by which he means where a merely drive-related way of acting used to be, like behind the back about the individual's conscious processes, ego shall be like the inside is what makes a person be able to think about their motives and how to deal with them. Others, like French psychoanalysis, like French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, hold that it's not just about being more transparent to oneself, but rather it should be about acknowledging one's desire. So Lacan would hold that it's not just about like the sheer amount of conscious material and introspection and individual gains, but rather to be true to one's desire and not rationalize too much. So anyway, it's about fostering insight, and the means to do that is interpretation. And if we think about that, we come across some sort of obstacle or difficulty that has to do with translating German terms into other languages. I think in English, in French, in Spanish also, probably in other languages as well, we don't have like the proper way to translate the difference between the two German words Interpretation and Deutung, which will both be translated as interpretation. But in German, there's like interpretation one, that is the process we have if we interpret texts, spoken word contributions in a hermeneutic way. We find the meaning behind a text, and that is interpretation, of course. But the German word Deutung, which would also be translated as interpretation, is more some actual analytic procedure. It's not about it is not just about finding meaning, but rather, well, deconstructing meaning. Or like in chemical analysis, find out which are the ingredients that well, make for mental idea, something like that. So interpretive work in clinical psychoanalysis also means that process of deconstruction. It's not about synthesis, but about analysis. Yeah, finding out the ingredients of a symptom also. So Freud's view is that that is sufficient, that analytic part of talking to a patient. And he holds that a patient's ego will set things together again. The analytic work is analytic in the very basic meaning of that word. And once we analyzed symptom formations, for example, a patient will be relieved of his or her symptoms because they don't work the way they did once we analyzed them together with the patient. So we also have to bear in mind that there is a myriad of different psychoanalytic or psychodynamic treatment methods in contemporary psychotherapy. It's not just only the use of the couch, but in relation to what a patient presents, we find different modifications of classical psychoanalysis. I won't be able to talk about that today, but rather presents some more conceptual cornerstones that play a role in the consulting room. That is, of course, the concept of resistance. Psychoanalytic process in the consulting room is not just about giving a patient a list of insight he or she should have sooner or later, but it's about a process of relational work. And that is also the case because usually when trying to relieve a patient of their psychopathological symptoms, there is some or more incidence of resistance to change or to insight, because psychoanalysis thinks of symptoms as a compromise formation, as the best way to deal with mental conflicts. These compromise formations come at a high price, of course, if we think of how symptoms of mental illness present, well, some sort of inhibition in life and in mental life also, but it's still the best possible way to deal with conflicts. So if we take that away from the patient, he or she will unconsciously answer to that with resistance to change, because change is something, can be something very scary. And that is why psychoanalytic processes take some time to work through resistances. We do that by using the therapeutic relationship and by using what has been described as transference and countertransference. That means the repetition or the actualization of internalized models of relationships. So a patient in psychoanalysis might repeat something that has to do with his or her primary caregivers in relation to his psychoanalyst. And that is also something that is being worked through in clinical psychoanalysis. What are these internalized models? What do we expect from others? What do we long for in others? And what does that have to do with our biography and the way we grew up? And that is something that comes into play from both sides, also from the side of the psychoanalyst, who also most likely has had a biography and parents and, well, conflictual stages in their lives. And then what we do is not just, like I wrote on the slide before this one, to do interpretive work, but we do interpretive work within the therapeutic relationship. And German psychoanalyst Alfred Lorenzer described that by using the terms scene and situation. And it's not so easy to translate that into English. Would be something like understanding the scene or scenic understanding, which is a bit misleading because it's not just a scenic view, but a view on scenes that is done. And central to that is that we have different particular scenes, each one a particular scene, and the idea that behind different particular scenes, there is like a common situational structure we can understand or can discern. Various particular scenes have something in common, and that is called the situation. And I prepared video example for that. I'm going to show you. This is not an actual patient, but an actress playing a patient. And in that patient role, the patient is around 60 years old, entering psychoanalytic treatment with presentations of depressive symptoms of depression, due to the fact that in her life recently there were changes she cannot yet cope with. Her children left the house once they became adults. Her own parents died recently, and her husband chose new hobbies and is away from home more often than before. We did that DVD material in German, of course, but I subtitled it, so you probably get an idea. And then I'll explain what that has to do with understanding seeds. I think it's about 3 or 4 minutes long.
Ich muss tatsächlich alleine durch.
Das ist auch eine ziemlich einsame Vorstellung. Sie haben so viel Veränderungen, mit denen sie ringen müssen, und gleichzeitig ist das Gefühl da, das geht auch nur allein, nicht mit anderen.
Ja.
Hm.
Ich will nicht einsam sein. Ich will auch nicht allein sein. Jetzt haben sie mich zum Heulen gebracht, ja. Bravo. Toll.
Gleichzeitig ist etwas, wo ich das Gefühl habe, damit sind sie gerade nicht allein. Das teilen wir hier gerade.
Aber das hat überall überhaupt keinen Platz. Das will einfach niemand sehen.
Haben Sie das Gefühl, Georg segelt weg, wenn Sie sich so zeigen?
Ja, der hält es nicht aus. Der will immer, dass alle fröhlich sind und zufrieden sind und happy sind und ja, keine Probleme haben, ja. Die Kinder wollen das auch nicht, ja. Die sind gerade selber ein Problem, ja, mit Familie basteln und Wohnung einrichten und Kind großziehen. Der Einzige, der mich echt versteht, und das fasse ich nicht, ja. Ich will das nicht. Das Einzige, das ist der Hund. Ja. Alle anderen schauen über mich hinweg. Was hat sie denn schon wieder, die Alte? Irgendwie kann ich nirgendwo sein, wie ich wirklich bin. Weder in der Arbeit noch zu Hause. Auch bei den Kindern. Sogar Bärbel will eigentlich nicht, dass ich so bin, wie ich bin. Wollen Sie, dass ich so bin, wie ich bin? Sie sind wahrscheinlich der Einzige.
Der Hund und ich, so treue Begleiter, die...
Der Hund und Sie. Mein Gott, wie traurig, oder? Ist das nicht traurig? Ich finde es traurig. Aber irgendwie auch lustig.
Ja.
Ja. Ich sehe sie gerade, wie sie mit meinem Hund auf der Treppe sitzen.
Hm.
Drollig.
Vielleicht steckt in dem Bild ja auch so eine Vorstellung, ein Wunsch, das sind Beziehungen, in denen sie nicht verlassen werden. Wo Georg nicht wegsegelt, wo die Kinder nicht das Haus verlassen, wo niemand stirbt. Also Beziehungen, wo sie ja, vielleicht auch mehr Sicherheit haben, dass jemand da bleibt.
Ja.
What I wanted to show you with that example is something that has to do with understanding scenes and the difference between scene and situation. If we follow that idea of what psychoanalysis does in the consulting room, we have two scenes the patient describes. And scene one would be when she talks about the only one who understands me is my dog. That is would count as one scene. And scene two would be when she says that her psychoanalyst, me, is probably the only one who accepts her as being the way she is. And understanding these two scenes in terms of what is the situation, that that constitutes these two scenes is what I try to put in the thing I say at the ending of that scene. There is a common aspects to these two scenes, the one with her dog and the second with me, that there is well, a take of loyalty to it, or wish to have loyal relationships to others, where she is not the left one, people don't leave her. And that is what understanding the scene is about. There are some scenes we as psychoanalysts are part of, we are more or less directly addressed, and that can present as a way to think about other scenes a patient talks about. So and then the interpretive work has to do with finding the common situation to different scenes. For example, the patient being concerned with a wish for, a longing for relationships where she doesn't need to be afraid that others leave her. So coming to the second part of my talk, the other two will be a bit more brief than the first one. So we can try and transfer that, especially the methodological part of that, to other fields. And that has been done all through the history of psychoanalysis, and also as a transfer to the field of culture and cultural psychoanalysis. So the most important part of that transfer is that it's not a transfer of theory, at least not in the first place, but a transfer of method. Of course, we can transfer the theory of Oedipal conflicts to other dramatic pieces or to film, but that would not be too scientific and not too interesting. Or not as interesting enough, but rather we transfer the method, and by that we we build the ground to have actual new insights in other fields, not just finding theory in other fields. Transferring method would mean transferring the idea of transference and countertransference, so the actualization of internalized relational patterns, and understanding scenes the way I just presented in the consulting room. If we do that, we come across a huge problem in comparison to the consulting room, because in the consulting room, there is a dialogue between two subjects, two people having their history and having their feelings and relational patterns. And if we don't talk to a patient and apply psychoanalytic method, but look at cultural phenomena or social processes, we don't have that intersubjective, interpersonal structure, like in having a conversation with a patient. And the answer we can find in psychoanalytic methodology is that we see the other, like a film we try to understand psychoanalytically, or a cultural process, as a quasi-subject. For example, we can look at a film and evaluate the feelings that specific film produces in us. And we can think of, well, what kind of film does that to us? That will probably become more clear later. And the quasi-subjective idea, or the idea of the other, or the subject matter of study as being a quasi-subject, means to apply psychoanalytic method in terms of exploring a relation we have to something we are opposed to other fields. Also, in a consulting room, the interpretive work has to do with telling a patient something and then looking at a patient's reaction to it. Will that foster insight? Will that produce new memories or feelings towards oneself? And in a movie theater, or when dealing with with the news and political developments, we don't have the same structure. We cannot enter a movie theater and give a film an interpretation and then expecting the film to react to that or to be different than before. That is the case with the patient. The patient will react to our interpretation. A film will more or less stay the same. So we need to find an answer to what interpretive work does in that different fields of psychoanalytic investigation. And one thing would be to differentiate between the two meanings the English word interpretation can have in German, like Interpretation and Deutung. So we also analyze cultural phenomena in terms of dissecting it, or in terms of exploring the different ingredients that play a role in making a cultural or society process the way it is. And that also has to do with making psychoanalytic interpretations accessible to the public. In a consulting room, we'll talk to a patient and make them aware of something or provide them with possible insights. And we can do that in the cultural field as well, when psychoanalytic interpretations are presented to an audience that can react to that in different ways. So what we do is to take psychoanalytic method and move it out of the consulting room into different fields. And that has been done with psychoanalytic social psychology, for example. Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlich did that in exploring the post-war German community in the 1950s and 1940s and 1950s, and described an incapacity to mourn what has been lost during World War II and Nazi Germany, and explored that in terms of what the second generation, the generation of people being born in Germany after the end of World War II, how they looked at their parents and grandparents. Another famous example is Turkish Cypriotic psychoanalyst Bamik Volkan, who studied social trauma in international political conflicts over the course of time. Just before I started the lecture, I read the news about what happened in Israel and the Middle East today, and I thought about, well, shouldn't I include something about that in my talk? And then I decided against that, but still I felt it is a bit strange to set the focus on cinema when there's so much disturbing processes happening right now around us. Transference can mean enter the field of social psychology, political process, cultural processes, but also psychoanalysis and art in different fields of artistic media, literature and film, of course. Freud was skeptical about music, but that is, of course, also included, and also visual performative arts and others. It's not restricted to that, and probably the hugest advantage psychoanalysis has lies in the fact that this transfer of methodology can use to enter all sorts of fields, organizations, of course, cultural processes. I'm going to use the rest of the time I've left in my talk to exemplify that transference of method to the field of film, and that is the third part of my talk. And the second stage of psychoanalysis can enter the movies, and there are different film psychoanalytic traditions one can discern. Some of them are non-systematic ones. We have psychoanalysts commenting on film without making clear what their methodology is. And these approaches are often very theory-driven, and we can find, of course, we can find neurotic conflicts in a Woody Allen movie. But the more interesting part is not to apply theory, but apply method, like I said earlier. We have a second tradition in the wake of Lacanian psychoanalysis. That is what Slavoj Žižek does, for example, analyzing film in the wake of structural psychoanalysis. And we have, I called it the German school because these are the scholars I'm most familiar with. But what constitutes that type of psychoanalytic approach to film is the application of method and the resorting to understanding scenes in reception of a film. And that's what I'm going to present in more detail. If we look at film psychoanalytically, we can analyze characters in a movie, of course, because they are individuals that in a good film have an inner world and are constituted as mentally constructed individuals. Second level would be analyzing the director. That also has been done lots of times. I find it not very satisfactory because, of course, we can look at a film directed by Quentin Tarantino and think of him as a person that likes feet, for example. But, well, is that also interesting? So we can also we can always come to the result that that specific film by that specific director, that does say something to us about the director. He invented that. But, well, the limits to that type of interpretation are, there are very narrow boundaries in terms of what results that can bring about. So what I propose is to focus on the third level, analyzing the film based on the viewer's reaction, because that is the most direct way and the most convincing way we can apply psychoanalytic method to a film by analyzing the relation between a film and ourselves in reception. We need to bear in mind a few things when we try to do that, and not in every instance that has been reflected upon in a sufficient way. We need to bear in mind the specificity of film as an artistic medium, the film's mediality. We should come to different results when analyzing a film compared to analyzing the book a film probably was made of, because it's a different medium. There are different artistic possibilities a film or a novel has, which the respective other does not have. So that's the first thing we need to bear in mind. That is connected to a second thing, the role of form. We interpret a film psychoanalytically. It's not just about the filmic or a film's narrative, but also the way it is set, or filmic shots or perspective or music or lighting and acting, of course. It's not just about the story, but also the stage where the story is set. And a third thing we need to bear in mind is the focus on the film and not so much the context. If Christopher Nolan brings out a new film, then we of course know that this is a Nolan film and that he has received various Academy Awards and directed other famous movies and has an issue with time and temporal stuff in film. But by analyzing, psychoanalyzing a film, we should try and leave that, at least relatively, leave that at the side and enter reception to that specific movie. Of course, we know something about a director, or we know about how a film has been perceived by filmic critique or audience response, but that should not be misundertaken as something that is in the film, but is in the film's context. I'll show that in a brief example as well. I'll probably have to cut that short a bit. It's a piece or a small segment I took from the movie No Country for Old Men by the Coen brothers. Probably most of you are familiar with that. And we see, well, probably those who are not familiar with the film don't need to know that much in advance. We see a unusual guy entering a gas station.
How much?
69 cents.
And the gas?
Y'all getting any rain up your way?
What way would that be?
I seen you was from Dallas.
What business is it of yours? Where I'm from? Friendo?
I tried to show you by this is that in a film psychoanalytic interpretation, we probably as a group would collect impressions that came up in the reception of that specific scene. And what is important is that it's not just the relationship between us and that scary stranger, but rather the relation between us and the movie as a whole, the way it is constructed, not just persons or characters interacting with us through that movie, but looking at what type of object is that movie? What does it do to us? Can scare us, can amuse us, it can disorient us. And that is the important point. It's not the stranger, scary guy is called Anton Chigurh. It's not just the relation between us and Chigurh that can be scary or fascinating, but we look at our relation to the film as a whole. So that, as I argued in that book, you see there, psychoanalysis and film, there are two leads we try and follow in psychoanalytically interpreting a film. First, it would be, which object am I faced with? That is what I was trying to describe. So it's not just an object in terms of specific characters, but the film as a whole, with its music, its shots and perspective. And the second lead would be, which are possible latent structures. And in terms of No Country for Old Men, I argued that it is actually a film that gives an impression of depression in old age, with all violent feelings that come across that, with all ideas of mere chance, like in a coin toss, what will happen next, and also the impression, the subjective impression of a person suffering from depression in old age, of time moving too fast around them to be able to cope. So we can do that systematically, of course, which we haven't had the time yet. But in a more systematic way, we enter watching a film by taking a resonant or receptive stance, watch a movie, of course, write a protocol, like in terms of try and structuring what it is we have been watching. We collect what I call irritations, like something that shakes up our, as psychoanalysis would say, evenly suspended attention, which are the scenes that speak to us most directly. We can do that as an individual or as a group and collect irritations, explore quasi-intersubjective object relations, what type of object is the film to us, and then formulate an actual interpretation in terms of a hermeneutic way of thinking about meaning in a film, and then formulate an interpretation in terms of the German Deutung in a public setting, that is formulating something the public can can answer to and discuss. And doing that, we, like you see in the fourth bullet point here, collecting irritations, that these can be 3 different types of irritations. There can be gaps in understanding that come up if we watch a film, something that we cannot really understand or grasp. The second type of irritation would be an intensive affect, by which a film speaks to us. And the third type of irritation would be semantic nodal points, as Freud coined it in the interpretation of dreams, something where we think, well, that is a theme a film revolves around, like the coin toss in No Country for Old Men. So following that, we can access different films. I put together 4 examples as examples of what the film psychoanalytic interpretation might end up in and might result in. You can, for example, see Hiroshima Mon Amour by Alain Resnais as something that in its filmic structure gives an idea of trauma. So not just a film about trauma on the level of filmic narrative, but in our impact, in the impact the film has in our reception, it has a traumatic structure in terms of presenting the idea of a disruptive experience and disorientation. Second example would be what the movie Funny Games by Michael Haneke does to us by breaking the 4th wall in that movie. The movie speaks to us in a really direct way. The killers in the movie speak to us directly. They ask us what they should do next while torturing a family. And that is a very scary way of confronting us with what we are when watching a movie and watching a crime scene in a movie, for example. Recently, I gave a talk on Christopher Nolan's Tenet, where the idea of a temporal pincer movement is pivotal in the film's narrative. And I argue that the film also does that to us. It temporarily pincers us in terms of the backward-forward disorientation it brings about. And we can also do that with streaming series, for example. In the introduction, you learned that I also wrote about Game of Thrones and about House of the Dragon. And we can also psychoanalytically interpret a series like Stranger Things. That's a bit more difficult because there's so much material compared to 90 or 120-hour minutes movie. So that makes it more difficult to interpret a TV show with various hours of material. But in terms of Stranger Things, I argued that when in the movie, we see, at least in season 1, several times the different generations being disconnected from one another, not just generations, but the different ages. In season 1, it's most of the time the kids having their own fight, the adolescents having their own fight, and the adults having their own fight. And I argued that that probably shows that each generation has to fight their own monster. What the kids fight for in Stranger Things is, well, they're having a fight against or with, they're struggling with the lost naivete of childhood by the awareness of mortality, while the adolescents struggle with the idea of what sexuality brings to life once it is discovered, and the adults struggle with losing a child or having a child growing into a grown-up. So that is probably something we can discuss. For now, I'm gonna close by giving a few more thoughts on what is critical about that, since we're in the unit of criticism here. What psychoanalysis can actually do in terms of critique, not just in the movie theater and when interpreting films, but also in terms of social psychology, cultural psychology. It is basically a critique of ideology. What psychoanalysis can foster insights into is how cultural products and cultural processes are structured, and what sublime or what subconscious messages probably are brought about in mainstream cinema, for example, or in political rhetoric. That is something that is critical about the psychoanalytic approach. And specifically, psychoanalysis can tell us something about the tensions between the individual and the society. Usually, we think of films as cultural products that depict that tension between the individual and society, between different societal processes. Sorry, that can be shown in a movie. So that is probably something we can discuss together. For now, thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to discussing these things with you. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you. Hands are raised, clapping. Of course, you can't hear them.
Yeah.
You can only see them. We have one question in the chat, but it was there even before you began to speak. So I suspect that it's less about your talk than about something in the field of psychology. So I'm going to wait on that. While we see what else is generated from the audience, I wanted to ask, I have two questions really, one of which comes from a place of complete ignorance. But probably the more immediate one is to ask if you could talk more about critique of ideology, psychoanalysis, because that's a big ask for psychoanalytic theory to actually, tell us about our own ideology. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I'm going to borrow an example from Slavoj Žižek that probably some of you know. In his film, A Pervert's Guide to Ideology, he presents as a first example, and that's kind of I'd say the methodological example he uses. I think it's a John Carpenter movie, They Live, from the 80s, where there are alien invaders, probably, and there is a type of sunglasses you can use, and if you put them on, you can actually read that which is meant to be a subliminal, subconscious message, and it's written all over any billboard: obey, consume, don't ask questions, something like that. The protagonist can see that by putting on that type of sunglass. And what Žižek does with that is that he takes this as an example of how ideology is part of everyday life and of cultural products. so in other instances, in mainstream cinema, especially, we have these types of messages, like if in the end of a romantic comedy, the structure of the nuclear family is restored, then this counts as a happy ending. And of course, there are other things, especially maybe in some kids' movies, that there are messages about a good life, which is not bad. There's nothing bad about a kids' movie having a happy ending. But I think it's it's an interesting take to see which serves as now things are in place again. And that psychoanalysis is not the only means to achieve that end, to think about a critique of ideology. But I think it is something psychoanalysis can contribute.
And does genre play a role in that? Because when you bring up the rom-com, I mean, that is something where the reason why I'm watching it is because I know I'm going to get that nice ending in an hour and a half.
Yes, of course, and that is yeah. Why shouldn't we? But and it even makes it more interesting, I think, to say, okay, this is kind of a healed world, not just in terms of romantic partners, but this is a way we can agree upon as a world that is in order again, or where things are in place again. So genre probably plays a huge part, and not just in rom-coms, but also in
I'm thinking of detective
in any
novels.
other genre. Can't think of a good example right now.
Well, detective novels have some of that same, we already know that order will be restored, and that therefore order must be good.
Yeah, but
justice will prevail.
Maybe even in an art house movie, we can think of, well, there are rules to it as well, but different rules in a different order.
I have another question for you, but I'm going to open up the chat. Now, so there is a question. I don't know if you can see it, from Asale Aranki.
No, I can't, strangely.
Then maybe it's just coming to me as the host. I'll read it aloud. You can answer it if you think it's appropriate. The question is, what do you think about the IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz and endorsed by Gabor, is it Mate?
Yeah, I guess.
And how does it fit into the classical view of the human mind? I think that's asking you to comment on something that you didn't really talk about in your paper, but
I don't know very much. Thanks for the question. I think that's a fruitful addition to what I was talking about and to psychoanalysis. I can't really talk about that very much. I know that it gained a lot of popularity, and I think it shares some basic tenets with psychoanalysis in terms of, well, experiences we have, interactions and communications we have. That is something that informs our inner world, and of course, family relations play a huge role in that, because these are the relationships and the interactions we have during the years where a lot of our mental structure is constituted. But I can't really compare these two because I don't know that much about IFS. There's David Wilson writing in the chat that he asks to be unmuted.
I'm not seeing, we're seeing different messages, so he must be writing.
Yeah, that is strange.
We'll unmute him. Can you unmute David? There's another talk. Meanwhile, can I read you another question?
Sure.
All right, this one says, hi, Dr. Storck, thank you for your talk. I know your talk discussed how psychoanalytic theory and practice are widely applicable, but I was curious if you think that there are any places where psychoanalysis is not applicable, and why?
Mhm.
If a human psyche develops within the tension of nature versus nurture, does a Western psychoanalytic theory always apply to other societies, their films, their understandings of mental illness and wellness? Do you want
Yeah.
me to repeat any part of that?
No, I think I got it. Thanks for the very complex question, but important question. Well, I think, of course, psychoanalysis is not applicable at all if it's not about mental phenomena or group relations, something like that. And of course, there's a long history of psychoanalysis talking about like the Western world or early 20th century Vienna. And there's no actual proof that it's not just about that specific group of people and that specific group of time and region of the world where Freud talked about talked with patients about their mental development and mental conflicts. But I'd still argue that psychoanalysis as a method has something to say about people in different regions in the world if psychoanalysis takes into account that these are placed into different historical and cultural contexts with, like, it's not just all Vienna and it's not just all 1895, but I think a psychoanalytic method, in as much as it places like a researcher's or a clinician's subjectivity in a very central point, can interact with that which is unfamiliar in different cultures. So I think it's very fruitful to have psychoanalysis in Asia, for example, or, well, in any part of the world, as long as we take into account that these are societies that have a different historical background and a different context in terms of family, in terms of what is regarded as shameful or forbidden. So on a very abstract level, psychoanalysis can be applied in that fields. And a different aspect would be that psychoanalysis can be applied anywhere, but usually in an interdisciplinary context. So I think it would be pretty arrogant and not too scientific to say, well, we're psychoanalysts, we can explain the world of politics to any other field and to any person, instead of working together with different disciplines and contribute a specific part to a complex discussion on political process or cultural processes.
Okay. Now, David Wilson has been unmuted. He asked to be unmuted, and I know you have worked together in the past. So David, can you speak so that we can hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me. Thank God. Timo, hello, how are you?
Hi, fine. Nice to hear you.
Yeah. A question. So if Freud's civilization and its discontents represents the death of the altruistic subject, as you noted, the death of the active agent in a way, how do we capture the altruistic being while being faithful to Freudian principles?
Well, first of all, we probably don't need to be faithful to Freudian tenets all the time. I think, well, the critique on that part is that it is too, not only too pessimistic, but too a view on the individual as too egoistic or too unsocial.
Yeah.
What Freud argues is basically that the need to be a social person comes with, like, the struggle of mitigating individual needs with group needs. To restore the altruistic subject, I think, well, probably Erich Fromm already did that when arguing that it's not different from a psychoanalytic approach to argue that it is a need in itself to search for relations to others or to help others.
Right.
Where there is a part in that Freudian work where he argues to actually love thy neighbor or love the person next to you. People need to be reminded of that. It's not in their nature to love their neighbors as they love themselves. So, but I think that is narrowing down psychoanalytic developmental psychology, of course, and cultural society, because I think the altruistic part in humans would be, well, basically we die if we are alone, and the consequences of that is not just other people are a means to an end, to survival, but like I'd argue that the human individual is not constructed to survive on their own biologically and emotionally.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
I have a question that I want to ask. It might come from left field, understanding that I'm not trained in psychoanalytic theory. I'm trained in visual theory as an art historian and an architectural historian who thinks about space. Mm-hmm. So your talk started off with the space between the analyst and the patient. And if there are other characters, the characters are in the head of the patient. So there's the dog, there's George, there are these people we hear about, but only in the mind of the patient. So there's really only two characters. And as you described it, it sounds like the analyst is a guide, but can't necessarily know in advance what is going to be, how enlightenment is going to occur. Mm-hmm. There will be insights that you can provoke, but you can't actually make them happen. If you could make them happen, the person could walk in the room, you could give them a plate and say, here are your insights, you can go home, right? So there's that very kind of, it's a space. That's how I'm reading it, as a space. But when we talk about films, we're in a much more complicated space where I'm not sure who the analyst is. Now, and to which you may say, well, we're not talking about psychoanalytic practice, we're talking about methodology. Maybe I missed that. Maybe I didn't fully understand it when you said that. But I am struck by what in my field we would call intention. And we would put it in quotes because, who knows what another person's intentions really are. But the director, and for that matter, the actors, want me to feel a certain way, so that it's not like an insight that somehow grows carefully. It's been placed there. When the monster comes out of the closet, every single person in the theater is going to scream. So it feels manipulative, and that's not such a bad thing, right? We go to the movies expecting to be manipulated, but it feels manipulative, whereas the therapeutic environment that you began with did not feel manipulative. It felt much more like a journey of two individuals in which so I'll stop there because I really don't know what I'm talking about. I really want to hear what you think and whether there's anything there.
Yeah, I think that's a very lucid comment on both fields and both stages. And of course, I totally agree that that which happens between an analyst and a patient is much more co-constructed and particular and specific, and one would have a different psychoanalysis with a different analyst, because these pair this pair will construct a different field or space between them. The connection between the two, I think, would be that on both stages, as I called them, the analyst would ask himself or herself, what does the other make of me? What role am I assigned? So, and of course, in a horror movie that which is to be evoked, and that role, the viewer and the analytic viewer as well, is that role he or she is assigned is much more fixed. We should scream, we should cry, we should cheer for someone. But at the same time, and that connects with the idea of a critique of ideology, a film has different layers. And even a mainstream Hollywood movie has different layers. And I think that's the interesting part. We don't need psychoanalysis to tell us that the Scream movie series should make us scream. It's in the title. But the different layers, I think, is what is important. Like, of course, we react to certain cues, and we can call that manipulation, or we can coin that audience control. But I think the interesting part starts if we think, well, I'm being put in that role of being scared of the movie, or maybe being identified with a monster. So you were talking about the more complex scenario. I think, or if we take the example of Funny Games by Haneke, that film is supposed to make us feel disgusted by the torture and make us feel scared by identifying with the family suffering from the attack. But at the same time, whether we want it or not, we are put into a role of identification with the killers. And that's what makes the film even more unbearable. And if we think of these different layers and the different feelings the film evokes between repulsion, fascination, and an unbearable identifications. So I'm going to stop there, but I think, of course, it's true what you say, but psychoanalysis at least tries to think about different layers between the immediate reaction that is being provoked.
The layers, yeah, that makes sense. I don't see another question from the audience. Although my chat is, are you seeing, Jamie? I'm just looking at our program assistant, because my chat is a little delayed. But with that, we're also at the end of our time, as it turns out. But this was a really thoughtful, very, you really guided us through an awful lot of material, starting from, sort of a definition of what psychoanalysis is, to which many of us are not the least bit, connected to or cognizant of, but to something in film where, of course, we experience it all the time, and analyze, not as analysts, but analyze what we think we're seeing. So that was a really wonderful way of tying those together. Thank you. Can we do another round of applause? I know it's silent, but it's there in the background. I really don't like Zoom for this reason. It never feels quite enough. Timo, thank you. I realize it's also very late where you are, and we appreciate the fact that you joined us at such a late hour.
Yeah, thank you. It felt really great talking to you and presenting the things to you. Thanks for the invitation and a vibrant discussion.
With that, I will close our meeting and say goodnight to everyone, and I will thank our speaker one more time. And there's another message coming in saying, get some sleep. That was a great presentation.
Thank you. I will.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.